In the capital city of Harrisburg, the stories of central Pennsylvania's historic African American community are being told in new ways. With the hopes of reconciling with the past, Lenwood Sloan and Yvette Davis, two of the individuals highlighted in this documentary, share the backstory of a community-based initiative of living history actors, the Pennsylvania Past Players. The Pennsylvania Past Players are based out of the McCormick Riverfront Library, a branch of the Dauphin County Library System. They seek to educate and inspire through the medium of living history. Through experiences like Live and Learn programs, community outreach, and walking tours, the Past Players are essential to the goals of the McCormick Riverfront Library and the T. Morris Chester Welcome Center and Research Collection. Thomas Morris Chester, the inspiration behind the naming of the Welcome Center and Research Collection, was the United States' first Black war correspondent. He served during the Civil War both as a writer and as a recruiter for Black soldiers. He also was an educator who was admitted to the English bar in 1870 and an assistant to the President of Liberia, where he looked to further relationships between Africa and Europe. Finally, as an abolitionist, he fought for the rights of African Americans in the courts, both in Louisiana and Pennsylvania. Chester's contributions to Harrisburg and the United States were honored by the dedication of the Welcome Center, as well as the Pennsylvania Past Players, and their mission to connect people near and far with the history of their communities that have gone unnoticed. Lenwood Sloan currently serves as the director of the Commonwealth Monument Project and the Pennsylvania Past Players in partnership with the Dauphin County Library System. Much of his work has been dedicated to preserving and restoring monuments across Pennsylvania in order to tell stories of diverse communities that have been lost to time and neglect.
The Dauphin County Library System was a partner with the Commonwealth Monument Project since 2018 for our series, which was called Live and Learn. So we grew into partnership when they agreed to dedicate their Welcome Center to the Thomas Morris Chester Project. We became not only cooperators, but collaborators and residents here.
The Commonwealth Monument Project stems from a 25-year-old organization called the International Institute for Peace Through Tourism. The IIPT develops 3-year initiatives across the world where communities come together to celebrate peace through physical locations and collaborative projects. The intersection of 4th and Walnut Streets is one of those locations. Labeled as a peace park by the IIPT, the gathering at the Crossroads Monument represents the history of Harrisburg's Old 8th Ward and the memories that were swept away during its destruction. The figures depicted in bronze look to tell the story of the Old 8th, as it was a stopping point for Frederick Douglass, as well as many other abolitionists and freedom seekers who traveled on the Underground Railroad. The gathering of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, William Howard Day, Jacob Compton, and Thomas Morris Chester were created in 2020 to honor the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, which returned the right to vote to African American men in Pennsylvania, and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. From here, Lenwood Sloan explains how the gathering at the Crossroads Monument represents more than just the lives of these 4 great orators.
It was pretty exciting at the time. There were 4 names at the top of the list, and at that time we had a really kind woman by the name of Nancy Mendes, who was coordinating the call for proposals, and it was her idea that instead of doing one statue, that we take the top 4 statues, top 4 names, 1 woman and 3 men, and we create a tableau vivant, a tableau that seemed to be living, That gave us the scale. We knew that we wanted statues that were human scale. We knew that we wanted them to be animated in a conversation, so that at a glance you kind of got a story out of the visual literacy. And the project really grew around our deep immersion. We had the riverfront project with the exemplary monuments. They were along the linear trail from Front Street to Division. And then we had our project along Walnut Street, which connected several of the spots where Thomas Chester, one of the four orators and figures that are exemplified in bronze, lived. And so we went to the city of Harrisburg and sought a petition to designate the stretch of Walnut Street from Commonwealth Avenue to Front Street as Thomas Chester Way. And the Chester Way connected the monument, which was a 19th century story, to the riverfront monuments about war and peace, which were 20th century stories.
With these stories in mind, women like Reverend Yvette Davis understand how important particular histories can be to a community. She reflects on this while sharing her story about her involvement in DCLS and the Pennsylvania Past Players.
I have only been involved with the Pennsylvania Past Players since 2015, but prior to my joining, the Pennsylvania Past Players was founded by Lenwood Sloan, and it is a company of living history interpreters who embody the personas of African Americans who were prominent in the history of central Pennsylvania. And their primary purpose is to educate, to agitate, as Lenwood would say, so that people begin to think about the history in central Pennsylvania differently and to be more inclusive of the African American contributions to central Pennsylvania history. Pennsylvania Past Players also want to stimulate conversation, new thought around democracy in general and how we have fought for democracy in Pennsylvania specifically. And they're also engaged in multi-generational liberation, intellectually, socially, and hopefully eventually materially, as we begin to look at our past and see how we can have an even better future.
So there are three schools of thought in interpretive presentation. There are reenactors, and reenactors are in the third person. They tend to not speak to their audiences at all. The audience is observing, looking backwards in time, and the reenactor is in his or her time and knows nothing about the time that came before or the time after. And in fact, they don't really even know you're there. There is the second school of thought, are storytellers who lift history and use historic costumes to create a sense of space, place, and time. But they tell a story without becoming part of that story. Living history is when the presenter is transformed into the person himself or herself, and rather than going backwards in time, the living history player comes forward in time. He or she knows they're in your time. They know that they're dead, they know that they're out of time, but they can comment on and make reflections on the things that they bring forward to share with you and the things that you live. So the Pennsylvania Past Players are a living history company. They're a delegation of spirits from the past who have been transported to the year 2023 by the viewer's interest. It's your imagination that conjures them up. and they're quite aware of the events that have occurred, the failures that they've made, the observations that they've had.
As members of the Pennsylvania Past Players, Lenwood Sloan and Yvette Davis fully understand how the organization has changed over time and what work has gone into developing an active living history company. This includes the shortcomings surrounding the development process and what has led up to today's roster of past players.
The Pennsylvania Past Players are the fourth national past player company. The Pennsylvania Past Players began in 2006. They were a company of 36 players in 6 counties. By 2010, which was the 150th anniversary of the Civil War, we did a 2015 company called 100 Voices, which was a tribute to the black soldiers of the USCT. And there, the USCT, the United States Colored Troop, young men were 16 and 18 and 20 years old. But the average interpreters of USCT soldiers are my age, and I'm not gonna tell you what my age is, but they're older men, you know, and so our idea there was to actually go to the Pennsylvania State System of Higher Education, POSHE, and through their Frederick Douglass Society, which was on all 14 campuses, actually recruit young men who were the ages of those soldiers and train them across the state. And they trained from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh and from Gettysburg to Erie to portray the stories of soldiers who had fought in the Civil War, African American soldiers. From that company are the 12 past players, 6 men and 6 women who are with the current company, and they're telling the stories of the what are known as the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and the 19th Amendment.
From what I recall from the stories of current past players, they were somewhat multicultural in the sense that there were black personas, there were white personas, and I believe that there were even Latinx personas. And the Pennsylvania Past Players traveled across central Pennsylvania and beyond.
We arrived at the current company, and I say arrived as opposed to picked, you know, because the experience of attrition has impacted us, as well as I said, 4 governors, COVID crises, a Black Lives Matter movement. We did not intend to be an African American theater company, although many people think of us as an African American theater company because our most recent project focused on the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But originally, historic committees were organized in all 8 counties, and each county nominated 4 characters from their county, 2 men and 2 women, to be the past players. So there were 4 York characters and 4 Gettysburg characters and 4 Carlisle characters. Ms. Harper, how do you feel about Abraham Lincoln?
Didn't give him much thought. He was busy doing the work. He was busy holding office.
Back in October of 2022, we had the opportunity to attend a workshop where Lenwood Sloan met with 7 of the 12 past players to hone their skills. Many different topics were discussed, including the past players having to answer questions on the fly and in character, such as, what if Abraham Lincoln had lived? They also had to recite a short biography of another player in preparation for a conversation with a tourist who may ask about one historical figure or another. Davis and Sloan reflect on what the training process has been for the past players over the years.
They went through a very rigorous training process. And that process, I wouldn't call it auditions necessarily, but The training that was designed and implemented by Lenwood Sloan and the partners that he invited to do additional training involved not only learning the history of the personas themselves, but to also become familiar with the dress, how to walk, what etiquette in the 19th century looked like, how to speak and the cadence of speaking in the 19th century. The training also involved putting together chautauquas, which brings together collections of artifacts representative of the persona's time, lifestyle, and culture. As a woman character, I have had to learn how to walk in a petticoat. I have had to learn how I am to hold a man's hand when we are walking down the street. I have had to learn how to use my fan to communicate different things, because that's how fans were used by women, to communicate to their spouses and to communicate to others, whether they are interested in the conversation, whether they're getting bored, whether it is time for them to just walk away or leave the space altogether.
They then went to the State Museum, where they received training and certification in the Tilden Museum technique of being docents and tour guides. So they just didn't put on the costume. Their last training was in Gettysburg with the Gettysburg tour guides test, where they had to pass a test to be step-on guides. Only after you had all 3 certifications did you get a costume, so you had to go through a great deal of certification.
My next experience came for Juneteenth commemoration, and then it was a lot of intensive, so to speak, on-the-job training and making sure that I maintained my persona as long as I'm in my costume, and this is one of the values of the Pennsylvania Past Players. We had to do an oration in a park, and just before the program started, there was some banging 1990s R&B piping through the speakers. And several of us, mainly me, started to dance in my costume. I cannot describe the dirty look that Mr. Sloan gave me, and I had to calm down. And then later on, I had to be reminded that no cell phones, no dancing, no 21st century dancing, none of that. Remain in the 19th century. We have to adjust to that particular event, and we actually have to go back in time. And we have to not only think about what were the historic events going on at that particular time, but how did our personas actually move through those times? How did they move through those events? What are some of the things that they may have been thinking? Who is it that they may have been speaking with or engaging with during those times? So with the interpretation, it is always something that is fluid. Sometimes we have to be ready for anything. And it's a constant, with the training, we have to constantly adjust our mindset to that. We also have to be able to remember and think about how we would have engaged with the other past players in a particular scenario. And finally, one of the more interesting and challenging but fun experiences was learning Victorian dance. And we could not learn how to dance in our street clothes. We had to learn how to dance in our period clothes. So there was a lot of a lot of folks stepping on my skirt. I was hitting the shorter people with the skirt. Getting swung around was a different experience. So it was challenging. It was a lot of fun. I had to adjust my thinking, and it was also a time to hone storytelling skills.
Ultimately, the past players represent both the life of the historical figure they play and the stories that come with them. In some ways, the past players can represent not just one individual, but sometimes entire families, as well as the communities that they called home. As a past player himself, Lenwood Sloan remembers how important the decision process was when it came time to decide which figures were to be honored in bronze.
So there was what I was referring to as the Pillsbury Bake Off. You know, when we did the monument, so the past players precede the monument project. The past players were founded in 2006, Pennsylvania past players. They had their height between 2010 and 2018, and the company was just re-emerging when COVID came. Hit us really hard, including our funding. But when it came time for the monument, the four top figures, 4 stories that floated to the top were William Howard Day, who had been the keynote speaker of the Grand Review of the United States Colored Troops, but he had also been one of the founders of the Free Public Library System. We knew we wanted to have William Howard Day. We knew that Thomas Morris Chester appeared on everybody's top list. Jacob Compton, the man who was responsible for spiriting Abraham Lincoln out of Harrisburg at his first inauguration. It's quite a story because everybody knows about Lincoln's assassinations near the end of the war, but Lincoln was threatened before he even was sworn in his first inauguration. And Jacob's story is an important story that's been historically left out. And so we knew we wanted to put Jacob Compton back into history. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper floated to the top because she impacted both Underground Railroad and the abolitionist movement, and both the suffragist movement and the civil rights movement of her time. The records of her speaking on the steps of the Capitol here were profound because of the time that she was for any woman to rise there. So the 4 figures of the monument became anchors of the company, but folks like William Goodridge, newspaperman, photographer, entrepreneur, agent of the Underground Railroad, connected York stories. We thought that's really great stories. Temperance worker, Amanda Berry Smith, who was also an evangelist and traveled with tent revivals. She was a great story to bring to the public. Also, Liddy Hamilton Smith was an important story to us, but also was Annie Amos, an organizer in the old 8th Ward and starting women's fraternal organizations, especially the Henry Highland Garnett Society, which raised the money for black soldiers' uniforms. And so we thought that these were some important women. We do not cast lookalikes. You know, we cast folks who are able to call up the spirit and become the person. So some of my favorite characters that are gone now, Dr. Palmer, a York doctor in the Civil War who helped discover field amputations. Cassandra Small and Mary Tabe, a woman who was a vivandier, a woman soldier. Vivandiers loaded the muskets for men and out there in the battlefield. Captain Zachariah of the Mechanicsburg Railroad, Frank Sellers, the student from Dickinson, Julia Peck Bond, who started orphanages for Civil War orphans.
The stories behind who is represented on the past player roster are truly fascinating, and the McCormick Riverfront Library will continue to host the past players going forward. With this in mind, the T. Morris Chester Welcome Center and Research Collection intends to add to those stories by providing the residents of Dauphin County with resources that allow them to discover their shared history and memory. When asked about what the Chester Center and the past players mean as organizations, Lenwood Sloan and Yvette Davis gave further insight into how diversity, equity, and inclusivity can be part of their projects.
The notion of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is full front right now, has been discussed every 20 years of the history that we perform. We find these first conversations about diversity in 1790 in Pennsylvania Senate. We find them again in 1840 and 1884 and 1906 and 1930, and we are in fact a diverse culture and an inclusive culture. You only have to open your closet or your refrigerator that has grape leaves and Italian pasta and Chinese noodles, and we have fajita pitas and pizza bagels, and so what we first try to do is to look at three different things: cultural specificity, cultural diversity, and multiculturalism. And they're used now as though they were synonyms. We know that that's a culturally specific thing, and no matter what your race is, we can all pause to respect the time. The same thing with St. Patrick's Day. We can all become Irish. We can all join in on Cinco de Mayo. We can all celebrate a Mardi Gras. These things are specific. Culturally diverse is, let's dig the difference. Fusion and multiculturalism is like that pizza bagel or that fajita pita, where I'm putting two things together and I'm making a new thing. America is a fusion culture. It's made up of all of the things. So it confuses us when we try to relegate or elevate one culture above the other. And what we're trying to say, particularly with our 8th Ward stories, is the 8th Ward was Harrisburg's first multicultural community. It was the first place where poor Irish, poor blacks, poor Germans, poor Jews lived together in a sense of harmony and common spirit. And it's exactly what the IIPT Peace project is looking for. It's a place where we all belonged and we all felt equal. And so.
I think that when, speaking of diversity, when diverse understandings, interpretations, diverse backgrounds, when they come together for one cause. I say this all the time. DEIB looks and sounds good on a web page. Living into it is hard. It's messy. And it requires a lot of work, some wrestling matches, some hurt feelings and forgiveness, a lot of grace. But if the people who are committed to those goals can stick it out, it is absolutely worth it. And it creates so many great possibilities. It creates so many practical visions that people can actually live into and continue to invite people to the table, and it will have multi-generational impact.
The Chester Center and Research Collection is a work in progress. Libraries historically have been introspective, quiet places where people go to immerse themselves and get away. But a welcome center where you're invited to engage with the history, and a research collection where you're invited to find your part of history and put it in the collection, add your name and your history. These are kind of new. So the thing I want people to remember is you are part of history. History is not fast, dry. You know, it's not frozen. It's not suspended. History is fluid. So the moment before you ask me the question is history, and the moment after, I answer it will be history. And that you're an active player in history. It's just the GPS. You need to beam yourself down to where do you fit into the story. How does it? What I want people to take away from our experience is the desire to know more. Is to see, the best applause for us is when somebody says to us, why didn't I learn this in school? I can't answer that question, but I can tell you, pass it on, tell it to somebody else. The real gift is when somebody remembers the story or says, I'm gonna tell my kids what I learned today. The takeaway is, this is not my story, this is your story. So there you have it.